And if you look at those pieces, either in the book or when they come up on the screen, you know, the composition, it's the perspective, the amount of work to get the information that he needed to in those scenes is really staggering. You know, Nellie, as you look at stuff in the book or as you grew up, were there things, parts of his, types of art of his that spoke to you, that you responded to better than others? Little Annie Fanny aside.
Little Annie Fanny definitely aside. I think the stuff he did when he was in the Army is the stuff that really grabs me. There's like a Christmas card in the book that I'd never seen. It's really beautiful and also it's very period to me. You know, it's of a totally different time. And I also like the personal, excuse me, the personal drawings, like the cards you did for my mother. Those are great.
And you mentioned your mom, who's here.
Mom?
Give her a little shout out to Adele Kurtzman. Let's see if we just open up to some questions, and we'll get into some other kinds of types of reactions to Kurtzman's art. But anybody have any questions they want to ask? Anything in particular?
You might want to talk to a bit about Art Spiegel. Talk so much about how
I should mention him up front. Yes, Stu Hampel. By the way, Stu Hampel, whose upcoming book, Dread and Superficiality, about Woody Allen and comics, is coming out from our ComicArts at Club. He mentions in terms of Art Spiegelman, yes, somebody like Art Spiegelman has talked on record and talked about how much he was influenced and how much he idolized Kurtzman. But, you know, again, that list is endless. I mean, there are people in this room that are cartoonists. Somewhere here, Harper's here, Myron's is here. There are lots of great cartoonists, and I think there are 2 classes from either SVA or Chris, where's your class from?
SVA.
From SVA too. So I think the influence is partly in this room. Anybody with a question about Harvey? Batten, another cartoonist?
Speaking of pioneering a graphic novel, Bill King did Black Mark in the early 70s, and I was shocked to find out Harvey did the layout for that. Do you know the story behind that?
There exists a full set of pencils that, yes, Harvey did for Black Mark. He and Gil Kane were friends. They had talked about actually writing a book together about comics. It never happened. And so clearly Gil appreciated Harvey's layout skills and asked him to do this. Curiously enough, Harvey was never credited. I didn't know this until years later when I came across some of the pencils. He wasn't credited in the original edition nor the Fantagraphics reprint. In fact, in Comic Art magazine, somebody wrote in and pointed this out, and Gary Groth actually replied indignantly that Harvey had nothing to do with those. And of course, he did. The pencils exist.
I emailed him and said, well, it's not your copy, and I'll send you the copies. And he said, don't.
Gary Groth knows better than you. Anybody else? Yes. I wonder if we can get a microphone or something to float around so it's hard to hear. Hold on, Carl's going to give you a microphone.
When Harvey left Mad Magazine, why is it that he never went back again? His work was obviously the best writers. Did he buy it back and
Question, when he left Mad, why he never went back?
Yeah, he
actually did at the very end. He and Bill Gaines made up, and he did do some things. I wouldn't, you know, not the best work, but he did. But you have to understand there was a great deal of acrimony on both sides when he left. For those of you, you know, a quick version of Mad is Harvey had basically single-handedly created it, and it saved Bill Gaines' publishing empire. It was also Harvey who convinced Bill and his mother, who held the purse strings, to turn the comic book into the magazine, which saved Bill again from the Comic Code Authority, because as a magazine, it was exempt from the self-policing censorship board. So Harvey felt pretty proprietary about Mad, but he clearly didn't own it because it was owned by Bill Gaines. And you have to understand that during this period, Hugh Hefner was a huge fan of Harvey and Mad, and he approached him quite openly, wooed Harvey, and basically said, if you ever want to leave that two-bit operation and work for me, I'll give you a full color and an unlimited budget. And so, bolstered by that kind of offer, Harvey concluded that the only way he would stay with Mad was if he owned 51% of it and had control. So through an intermediary, Harry Chester, Bill was confronted, and being the paternalistic owner he was flabbergasted and insulted. At the same time, he was nervous as hell that if he lost Harvey, he'd lose everything. So he was willing to compromise, and he said in interviews he would have given Harvey at least 10% and as much as 49%, he said in interviews, but he wouldn't give him 51. And Harvey wouldn't settle for a percentage less, so he left and went for Hefner. And ironically, again, this is where Harvey's decisions in hindsight don't look that good, but he went with Hefner, and Hefner gave him Trump, and he pulled the plug after 2 issues because he ironically ran into a tough financial time. And 5 years later, Bill Gaines sold Mad Magazine for a reported $5 million. So it's a kind of money Harvey never would have seen in his life otherwise. But he was convinced that throwing his lot with Hefner was better. So it's probably a book in itself because it's many layered. But he and Bill did eventually. It took some years, but they became friends again toward the end.
Over here.
Did Harvey ever work for Cracked magazine?
No.
There were a lot of magazines that came out in the wake of Mad, Cracked, and Sick, and tons of them that were all Mad imitators, but no, yeah.
And I was told not to read Cracked. It was not cool, according to my father.
His least favorite collaborator, John Severin, went to work for Kraft, and I think that was seen as kind of disloyal.
I have a question for Nellie.
I'm going to try to bring this in the back.
Oh,
If someone can help pass
can
this.
everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Growing up with a father who worked for Playboy and drew boobs and did Mad and such, what was forbidden?
Well, it's weird because the layouts were always on the table, and we're talking from the minute I could toddle up there. So I could see those, but it was somehow clear that I wasn't supposed to look at the magazines once they came into the house. Because that would have the photographic evidence, I suppose. I do remember a little bit of weak effort on his part to try to cover up the stuff on the table, but also the discipline by the time I came around was at a pretty low level. So I would just go up there whenever I wanted anyway, and A, look at the boards, and B, look at the magazines. So I can see everything is, I guess, the answer.